Put your hand on a rock, not metaphorically. Imagine you are standing in the desert of Nevada, somewhere in the Great Basin, and you have pulled over on the side of a road where a highway cut has opened a window into the deep past. The stone in front of you is layered, pale bands above, darker bands below, the ordinary stratigraphy of a planet doing what planets do. You run your fingers across it. It feels like nothing. It feels like stone. And then you notice the stripe. It is a few inches thick, maybe the width of two of your fingers pressed together. It is darker than the rock above it and below it, denser somehow. And if you know what you are looking for, if you have spent years reading about what this particular layer means, the act of touching it would be one of the stranger experiences of your life. Because that stripe is not just rock, it is time. Roughly 60,000 years of it, compressed into something you can cover with your palm. And the story it tells is not the one we normally tell about this planet. Below that stripe, an ocean full of life. Creatures so diverse, so strange, so thoroughly adapted to their world that many of them had no living descendants anywhere on Earth. Things that swam and burrowed and built shells and crawled across seafloors for hundreds of millions of years. A world that had been building in complexity, slowly and inexorably, for as long as anything that could reasonably be called complex life had existed on this planet. Above that stripe, almost nothing. A silence in the rock, a void where the fossils used to be, a world that had been, in the language of the geologists who study it, effectively sterilized. That stripe is the Permian-Triassic boundary. It marks, in the rock record, the moment the planet came closer to ending all complex life than it has ever come before or since. Scientists call what happened there the Great Dying. It killed, by the best estimates available, something in the range of 96% of all marine species on Earth, roughly 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species. Not a comet, not a solar flare, not a rogue planet wandering in from the outer dark. The Earth did it to itself, and it did it with carbon. There is a book that started me down this road. It is called The Ends of the World, and it was written by a science journalist named Peter Brannen. He physically traveled, to every major extinction boundary in the geological record. He stood at the rock cuts and the cliff faces and the road exposures where the worst moments in the history of life are written in stone. And he talked to the scientists who had spent their careers decoding them. And one thing that he came back to over and over, a thread he pulled through every single one of these catastrophes, was this. The 5 worst episodes in Earth's history have all been associated with violent changes to the planet's carbon cycle. Not 5 different causes, not 5 random catastrophes raining down from the sky. One recurring villain. The same chemical system that keeps Earth habitable, the same cycle that moves carbon between the air and the oceans and the rock and the bodies of living things, has 5 separate times in the last 500 million years gone haywire. And each time it did, the planet very nearly stopped being a place where complex life could survive. That is what I want to walk you through today. Not the broad outlines. We've all heard the words mass extinction, but the actual stories, the rock, the people who read it, the science behind what it means. And the question that sits at the end of all of it, the one that is harder to shake the longer you look at the evidence, is the carbon cycle going haywire again? But before we get to that, I need to tell you something I'm going to come back to at the end. Something that Brannen describes in his book that I've thought about almost every day since I read it. One of these extinctions, the worst one, killed so much life that the planet spent a period of time longer than anything you can currently imagine struggling to recover. Virtually lifeless, a geological ghost. I'm going to tell you exactly how long that was in a little while, but I want you to hold that question in the back of your mind as we go, because the number, when you finally hear it in context, lands differently than it would if I just said it now. Let's start at the beginning. Or rather, let's start with the scientists who first named the shape of the catastrophe. It is 1982, and David Raup and J. John Sepkoski Jr. are paleontologists at the University of Chicago. What makes them unusual in their field is not what they study, but how they study it. Most paleontologists work the way you might imagine. They find a fossil, they classify it, they describe it, they place it in the context of what came before and after. It is beautiful, painstaking, deeply specific work. Raup and Sepkoski did something different. They decided to count. Over years, they compiled a database, a census of life through time. They collected data on the appearances and disappearances of thousands of marine genera across hundreds of millions of years of fossil record. Not individual fossils, but lineages. Not specimens, but the broad categories that species cluster into. They asked a simple statistical question. When you look at the rate of extinction across geological time, does it stay roughly constant, or does it spike? And if it spikes, do those spikes stand out mathematically from the background noise? When they graphed their data, 5 intervals stood out. Unmistakably, categorically differently from everything else in the record. Individual extinctions had been noticed before. A geologist named Norman Newell had described several of them in the 1960s. But no one had quantified them in a way that showed, mathematically, that they were a different kind of thing. Raup and Sepkoski did that. They published their findings in the journal Science in March 1982, and the paper gave us something we still use today: the Big Five. 5 mass extinctions, 5 intervals in the last roughly 540 million years when the background hum of normal extinction, species going extinct at the ordinary pace that evolution tends to produce, was overwhelmed by a wave. Not a ripple, a wave. Events where the usual rules didn't apply, where whole categories of life that had existed for millions of years simply ceased to exist in spans of time the rock record can barely distinguish. Here is what the numbers actually look like if you have never seen them laid out in sequence. The oldest of the 5 happened around 443 million years ago in the late Ordovician period. The next happened in the late Devonian period, in 2 main pulses separated by millions of years, around 372 to 359 million years ago. The third and worst happened 252 million years ago, at the end of the Permian period, the one Peter Brannen's dark stripe marks. The fourth happened 201 million years ago, at the end of the Triassic. And the fifth, the one you almost certainly know about, happened 66 million years ago, when something large and fast fell out of the sky above what is now the Gulf of Mexico. To put the scale of this in perspective before we go any further, the oldest of these events happened 443 million years ago. The universe is roughly 3 times as old as the Earth. The Earth is roughly 10 times as old as the first of these extinctions, and the first of these extinctions is roughly 7 times as old as the moment those last dinosaurs looked up at the sky. The history we're talking about is not human history. It is not even dinosaur history. It is the kind of time that makes the concept of time feel slightly unreal. Now, let's go through them. 443 million years ago, the world looked nothing like what we know. There were no trees. There were no forests, no grasslands, no anything green moving in the wind, because land plants had barely appeared. The continents were a different shape, arranged in a different configuration, and the great majority of complex life on Earth lived in the sea. The late Ordovician oceans were extraordinary. Warm, shallow, teeming with life that had been evolving and diversifying for hundreds of millions of years. Trilobites, those iconic armored creatures that look vaguely like enormous aquatic beetles, were everywhere. Brachiopods covered the seafloor in mats. Crinoids, which look like underwater flowers but are animals, swayed in the currents. Corals built their structures. Cephalopods, early relatives of squid and octopus, moved through the water column. And then Gondwana arrived at the pole. Gondwana was the supercontinent that contained the landmasses that would eventually become Africa, South America, Antarctica, and Australia. In the late Ordovician, it drifted south until the land that is now Africa sat over the South Pole. Ice sheets formed. This is not unusual in Earth's history. Ice ages come and go. But the timing and the speed of what followed were catastrophic for the organisms that had built their entire existence around those warm, shallow seas. As glaciers grew, they locked up enormous quantities of water that had previously been in the oceans. Sea levels fell. The shallow marine environments that most of the world's complex life called home drained away. Habitats disappeared beneath retreating water, and then, almost as quickly as it had frozen, the climate reversed. The ice retreated. The seas flooded back. But the water that returned was different, depleted of oxygen, disrupted in its chemistry, carrying the scars of a world that had lurched violently between extremes. Life caught two blows back to back, and the fossil record shows the result. The traditional estimate has been that roughly 85% of marine species were lost. A 2025 study in the journal Science Advances, using revised methods, puts that figure closer to about 69.7%, a number so large it almost resists comprehension even at its lower bound. 7 in 10 species in the ocean, gone. What is particularly interesting about that same 2025 study is what it found about the mechanism. It was not simply the magnitude of the climate change that drove the extinctions, the raw degree of cooling and warming. It was the rate, how fast the climate moved. Life can adapt to almost anything if it has time. When the rate of change exceeds the speed at which evolution and migration can respond, the result is not adaptation. The result is collapse. This distinction between the degree of disruption and the speed of it is one I want you to hold on to because it becomes relevant again later in ways I won't tell you about yet. The second extinction, the late Devonian, operates on a different logic, and it is one of the stranger stories in the geological record. By the time we reach roughly 370 million years ago, the world has changed dramatically from the Ordovician. Life has made it onto land. Not in any impressive way, not yet. There are no mammals, no dinosaurs, nothing with a backbone that is fully committed to terrestrial life, but the plants have arrived. And not just arrived. In the Devonian, the world's first forests were spreading across the continents. Trees, actual trees with actual roots, were growing for the first time in the history of the planet. This sounds beautiful. It was beautiful. It was also, in ways no one could have anticipated, a disaster. Tree roots do something that no organism had done at scale before. They break down rock. The mechanical and chemical action of roots growing into stone releases minerals that had been locked up in the geological substrate for millions of years. Specifically, it releases nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, the chemical building blocks that aquatic organisms need to grow. Those nutrients washed off the land with the rain, traveled down rivers, and poured into the sea. And the sea bloomed. Algae thrive on nutrients. When nutrients flood into the ocean, algae populations can explode, massive blooms. And when those blooms die, when the algae exhaust their fuel, or the season changes, or the bloom simply reaches its natural end, all that dead organic matter sinks to the seafloor and begins to decompose. Decomposition is a biological process, and biological processes consume oxygen. When you have enough dead material decomposing in enough deep water, the ocean runs out of oxygen. It suffocates. The geological signature of an oxygen-depleted ocean floor is black mud, dark, organic, rich sediment that forms when the normal aerobic breakdown of organic matter stops and anaerobic bacteria take over. In the Devonian, black mud spread across the world's ocean beds. Two main pulses of extinction, which scientists call the Kellwasser events and the Hangenberg event, struck across a span of roughly 13 million years. At least 70% of species were lost, and some estimates run as high as 82%, though ranges like this carry real uncertainty. Everything that depended on a well-oxygenated ocean was in trouble. The armored fish that had dominated Devonian seas, the reef-building organisms, the diverse marine communities that had rebuilt after the Ordovician. Now, I want to be honest with you here, because this is a case where the science is genuinely contested in an interesting way. The proximate kill mechanism, ocean anoxia, oxygen-depleted water, is well established. The black mud is real. The fossil record is clear. What is not settled is what triggered the anoxia. The leading hypothesis, supported by a 2023 paper in the journal Nature Communications Earth and Environment, is the land plant story I just told you. But volcanism has also been proposed as a contributing factor. Some researchers have suggested small impacts. No scientific consensus has been reached on the initiating cause, and it would be dishonest to present this as more resolved than it is. The ocean suffocated. How it got pushed to that point is still being argued. What is interesting is that even in this contested case, the underlying logic is the same as everywhere else in the story. Carbon, in some form, mediating the catastrophe. Carbon drawn down from the atmosphere by the first forests. Carbon in the form of organic matter pouring off the land. Carbon in the oxygen-depleted sediment of the ancient seafloor. The exact path is disputed. The chemical thread is not. The third extinction is the one Brannen's dark stripe marks, and it is the worst thing that has ever happened to life on this planet. 252 million years ago, there was a crack in the earth in what is now Siberia. Not a single eruption in the way we normally picture a volcano. A cone, a plume, a dramatic event with a beginning and an end. What opened in Siberia was something else. A large igneous province, which geologists call a LIP, and which is less a volcano than a wound in the crust that refuses to close. Lava poured out of it not in one event, but in pulses, over a period of roughly 1 million years, covering an area of approximately 1.5 million cubic kilometers. To have any sense of scale, that is roughly the volume of the Gulf of Mexico in rock. But the lava itself was not the killer. What the lava did to what was already in the ground was. The magma rising through the crust intruded into ancient deposits of coal and carbonate rock, material that had been accumulating for hundreds of millions of years. When superheated magma contacts coal, the coal burns. When it contacts carbonate rock, it releases the carbon that has been locked inside. The result was an injection of carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere on a scale the planet had not experienced in hundreds of millions of years. The greenhouse effect accelerated. Global temperatures rose, the oceans warmed, and when oceans warm, several things happen in cascade. Carbon dioxide dissolves in seawater to form carbonic acid. As the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere rises, the oceans absorb more of it, and as the oceans absorb more, they become more acidic. This is not an abstraction. Think about what chalk is made of. Calcium carbonate, the same material that marine organisms use to build their shells and their skeletons and their reefs. Drop a piece of chalk in vinegar and watch what happens. The acid dissolves it. Now, imagine that process happening to every shell-forming organism in the ocean, the brachiopods, the corals, the ammonites, the foraminifera, not because someone poured vinegar on them, but because the entire ocean quietly shifted its chemistry over thousands of years. The organisms that needed calcium carbonate structures could not build them. They could not maintain the ones they already had. They died. Meanwhile, as the surface ocean warmed, it held less dissolved oxygen. Warm water holds less gas than cold water. You can test this in a kitchen. Watch the bubbles come out of a glass of cold water as it warms to room temperature. On a planetary scale, this means that as ocean temperatures rise, the water becomes less oxygenated. Deep ocean circulation, which normally drags cold, oxygen-rich water down from the poles to refresh the deep, slowed or stopped. The seafloor went anoxic. And in the most extreme phase of the Permian-Triassic extinction, it went beyond anoxic. It went euxinic. Euxinia is the condition where not only is oxygen absent, but the water contains active concentrations of hydrogen sulfide, the compound responsible for the smell of rotten eggs, a gas that is acutely toxic to aerobic life. Hydrogen sulfide is produced by certain bacteria that thrive in anoxic conditions. In the deep ocean of the Permian-Triassic, these bacteria may have dominated entire water columns, and some researchers have proposed that hydrogen sulfide, produced in the deep ocean, may have vented into the atmosphere in quantities high enough to poison it. The fossil record on the other side of Brannen's dark stripe is almost empty. What made it through was small, hardy, opportunistic. The organisms that had been the dominant life forms on Earth, The great marine communities that had diversified over hundreds of millions of years were, in a geological eye blink, gone. Up to approximately 96% of marine species, roughly 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species. Numbers like those need a moment to sit. 96%. If you imagine standing in a room with 100 people who represent the diversity of all marine life on Earth at the end of the Permian period, and then at the end of the Great Dying, 4 of those people are still standing. That is the scale of what happened. Not the ones who managed to escape, not the ones who adapted. 4 out of 100, everything else, gone. And now I want to tell you the number I made you wait for. After the Great Dying, life spent roughly 10 million years struggling to recover. 10 million years. Marine ecosystems could barely function. Forests did not return to anything like their previous complexity for perhaps that same length of time. For reference, that is longer than the entire period of time that has passed since the dinosaurs died. The asteroid that ended the Cretaceous, the event most people think of as the great catastrophe of Earth's history, happened 66 million years ago. We are 66 million years on the other side of it. The recovery from the Great Dying took a period of time that, in the context of our current moment, would extend from the death of the last non-avian dinosaurs to roughly now, and then keep going. 10 million years of a world that barely worked. The fourth extinction, the one that happened 201 million years ago, is in some ways the most quietly consequential of all 5, because without it, nothing that followed would have been possible, including you. At the end of the Triassic period, the world was dominated by large reptiles, not dinosaurs, or at least not the dinosaurs we think of. The ecological roles that in later periods would be held by dinosaurs, the large predators, the dominant herbivores, the animals that shaped the landscape, were held in the Triassic mostly by proto-crocodilians and other archosaurs, the broader group that dinosaurs belonged to but had not yet come to dominate. Dinosaurs existed in the late Triassic, but they were not yet the rulers of the world. They were mid-sized, opportunistic, filling corners of the ecosystem rather than dominating it. Then, the supercontinent Pangaea began to break apart. What we now think of as the Atlantic Ocean did not exist 201 million years ago. The land masses that would become North America and Africa and Europe were pressed together, a single continuous land. As they began to rift apart, pulled by the slow convection currents deep in the mantle, volcanic fissures opened along the boundary. Not a single volcano. A network of fissures stretching across what would become the eastern seaboard of North America, the northwest coast of Africa, and beyond, creating one of the largest flood basalt eruptions in Earth's history. Scientists call it CAMP, the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province. Here is how we know when CAMP erupted with the precision we do. Certain crystals, zircon crystals formed in the cooling lava, contain trace amounts of uranium and lead. Uranium decays into lead at a known constant rate. By measuring the ratio of uranium to lead in a zircon crystal, you can calculate, with remarkable precision, how long ago that crystal formed. In 2013, a researcher named Blackburn and colleagues applied this technique to zircon crystals from camp lavas and pinned the eruption onset to approximately 201.3 million years ago. That date is, in geological terms, essentially synchronous with the Triassic-Jurassic extinction boundary in the rock record. Carbon dioxide from the eruption spiked, ocean chemistry shifted. More than 50% of all genera went extinct. The large reptiles that had dominated the Triassic, the proto-crocodilians, the other archosaurs, many of the creatures that had been competing with dinosaurs for ecological space, were gone. And the dinosaurs, the ones that survived, expanded into a world that had been vacated for them. They would hold it for roughly 165 million years. This is the pattern that Brannen traces across the rock record and that I find genuinely unsettling when I sit with it. Each extinction does not just destroy, it clears. It removes the organisms that had occupied the dominant ecological roles, the ones that had evolved over millions of years to hold their niches against all competition, and it opens the world for whatever was left. The organisms that survived the Great Dying were, in many cases, the ones that had been marginal in the Permian world, not the dominant forms. The scrappy ones, the generalists, the things too small or too flexible to have been caught in the specific death traps the extinction set. And from that marginal survival, entirely new worlds grew. There is something almost impossible to get your head around in that. The world you live in, the world of mammals, of birds, of flowering plants, of insects in extraordinary diversity, is not the world that would have existed if the carbon cycle had stayed stable. Every comfortable thing about the biological world we inhabit is an inheritance from catastrophe. The evolutionary path that eventually produced your ancestors was cleared repeatedly by events that killed the vast majority of everything else. Hold that thought. We will come back to it. Now we reach the fifth extinction, the one with the most dramatic story, the best detective work, and the most celebrated discovery in the history of paleontology. The KPG extinction, the one most people know as the death of the dinosaurs. It is the late 1970s, and a geologist named Walter Alvarez is working in a gorge near the town of Gubbio in Italy. He is studying the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary, the thin layer of clay that separates the age of the dinosaurs from everything that came after. Above the layer, no dinosaurs in the fossil record. Below it, the full Cretaceous world, complete. That clay layer is, in the rock, the exact moment the world changed. Walter Alvarez is trying to figure out how long it took for that layer to be deposited, trying to get a sense of the pace of the extinction. He needs a way to measure time in that thin band of clay, and for this, he turns to his father. His father is Luis Alvarez, a physicist who had won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1968 for his work on subatomic particles. Luis knew about measuring trace elements, the kind of meticulous geochemical analysis that his son needed, and Luis knew two colleagues at the Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory who could help, nuclear chemists named Frank Asaro and Helen Michel. The four of them, Walter Alvarez, Luis Alvarez, Frank Asaro, and Helen Michel, began looking for a way to date the clay. The element they chose to measure was iridium. Iridium is extraordinarily rare on Earth's surface. Rare because when the Earth formed and its iron core differentiated from its rocky mantle, most of the planet's iridium sank to the center along with the iron. The iridium you find in surface rock is almost entirely the residue of a slow, constant rain of cosmic dust, tiny particles from space depositing themselves on the Earth at a known, roughly constant rate. By measuring how much iridium had accumulated in the clay layer, the team could, in principle, estimate how long the layer had taken to form. They expected to find very small quantities, background levels, the ordinary signature of cosmic dust settling over time. They found 30 times the background level, and it was not a local anomaly. The iridium was everywhere. Every sample from every location where the KPG boundary clay had been found contained the same enrichment. The global signature of something that had happened simultaneously everywhere on Earth at the same geological moment. There was one explanation consistent with the data. An extraterrestrial object, something large enough to carry truly enormous quantities of iridium, had struck the Earth at the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary. The four of them published their findings in the journal Science in June 1980. The paper proposed the unthinkable: a mass extinction caused not by gradual geological processes, not by the slow drift of continents or the long exhale of volcanoes, but by a collision. For years, the asteroid hypothesis was fiercely debated. It was not simply skepticism about the science. It was a deeper resistance to the idea that random catastrophe could be the primary driver of the history of life. If a rock from space could end 65 million years of dinosaur dominance in effectively an instant, then the history of life was, in part, a lottery. The philosophers and scientists who had built their understanding of evolution on the idea of gradual, predictable change found that unsettling in ways that were hard to separate from the science itself. But the hypothesis had a testable prediction built into it. If an object that large had hit the Earth 66 million years ago, there should be a crater. In 1978, 2 years before the Alvarez paper was published, a geophysicist named Glenn Penfield was doing routine magnetic surveys for a Mexican oil company called Pemex, flying over the Yucatan Peninsula. He found something in the data that stopped him: a circular anomaly in the magnetic readings, an enormous ring buried beneath the sediment and the sea. His colleague Antonio Camargo saw it too. They presented it at a geophysical conference in 1981. Nobody connected it to the asteroid hypothesis. The finding was overlooked, filed away, nearly forgotten. Then, in the late 1980s, a University of Arizona graduate student named Alan Hildebrand began independently searching for the impact site. He tracked down Penfield's old data. Together, they published the formal identification in 1991. The Chicxulub crater, buried approximately 1 kilometer beneath the Yucatan Peninsula and the Gulf of Mexico, approximately 180 kilometers across. 180 kilometers, wider than the state of Connecticut, buried a kilometer underground, hidden for 66 million years, found first by an oil survey and then by a graduate student with a hunch. The asteroid that made it was moving fast enough that the impact released more energy than all of the nuclear weapons ever built, detonated simultaneously, many times over. It vaporized rock. It triggered megatsunami. It ignited wildfires across the Western Hemisphere. It threw enough debris into the upper atmosphere to block sunlight globally. An impact winter, a darkness that lasted long enough to collapse photosynthesis across much of the planet. Not a carbon crisis this time, not primarily. A light crisis, a cold crisis, a darkness. Though even here, the vaporized rock released CO2 and SO2, the chemistry of the atmosphere disrupted in a different register of the same fundamental disruption. 76% of all species on Earth went extinct. The non-avian dinosaurs disappeared completely. The mosasaurs, the pterosaurs, the ammonites, gone. The long, extraordinary experiment of the Cretaceous ended. And in the rubble and the ash and the slowly recovering world, the small, warm-blooded, adaptable mammals that had spent the entire reign of the dinosaurs living in the margins, mostly nocturnal, mostly small, mostly staying out of the way, began slowly and then very quickly to diversify into the vacated world. One of those lineages, tens of millions of years later, would produce primates. One of those primate lineages would produce hominids. One of those hominid lineages would produce you. You exist because an asteroid hit the Yucatan 66 million years ago. Not as a distant metaphor, as a direct, literal, traceable fact. Without that impact, the dinosaurs' dominance of the large terrestrial ecological roles would almost certainly have continued, and the small mammals in the underbrush would have remained small mammals in the underbrush. There was no reason from inside the Cretaceous world to expect otherwise. The dinosaurs had been dominant for 165 million years. They were extraordinarily successful. They were adapted. They were not going anywhere until they were. Now I want to step back from the individual stories and show you the thread that Brannen pulls through all of them. Because I think this is where the book earns its title and where the science becomes something more than a list of catastrophes. The carbon cycle. That is the thread. Here is the simplest version of how it works. The atmosphere contains carbon dioxide. Volcanoes release it. Plants and algae and other organisms absorb it, using sunlight to combine carbon with water and produce the sugars that power almost all life on Earth. When those organisms die, their carbon eventually returns to the atmosphere or the ocean or the rock. The ocean absorbs CO2 directly from the atmosphere, and the dissolved carbon eventually precipitates out as calcium carbonate, limestone, locking it into the geological record for millions of years. Weathering of rocks on land absorbs CO2 as well, combining it with minerals and washing it into rivers and eventually the sea. In a stable Earth, these processes balance. Not perfectly. The climate is always varied. Ice ages have come and gone, but within a range that keeps the planet's chemistry within the bounds that complex life requires. The system has a weakness. It corrects slowly. Think of it as a thermostat in a large building, one that takes thousands of years to register a change in temperature, and another several thousand to respond to it. If you add heat to the building at a rate faster than the thermostat can compensate, the temperature rises without limit. The thermostat is not broken, it is simply too slow. The same is true of the carbon cycle. It is not fragile in the sense of being easily disrupted by small perturbations. The Earth has handled millions of years of volcanic activity without catastrophe. What it cannot handle, what the rock record shows it has never successfully buffered, is carbon entering the atmosphere or the ocean faster than the slow geological machinery can absorb it. When that threshold is crossed, the cascade begins. First, warming. CO2 traps heat. The atmosphere warms. The oceans warm with it. Warm water holds less dissolved oxygen. Less dissolved CO2 shifts into the deep ocean. Deep circulation slows. Habitats that evolved in stable temperature ranges find themselves outside those ranges faster than migration or adaptation can respond. Second, acidification. CO2 dissolving in seawater forms carbonic acid. As concentrations rise, the ocean's pH falls. The carbonate system that shell-forming organisms depend on becomes unstable. Their shells thin. Their larvae cannot calcify properly. Reefs stop growing and begin dissolving. In the most severe cases, the chemical equilibrium of the surface ocean shifts so far that existing calcium carbonate structures begin to dissolve at the seafloor. Third, anoxia. As the surface ocean warms and stratifies, the mixing that normally brings oxygen-rich surface water down to the deep slows. As photosynthetic organisms in the surface water die and sink, bacterial decomposition in the deep water consumes what oxygen remains. The seafloor goes dead. In the worst cases, hydrogen sulfide accumulates. This cascade played out in different specific configurations at the end of the Permian, at the end of the Triassic, in the Devonian seas, driven by the first forests rather than volcanism, but through the same oxygen depletion mechanism. In the Ordovician, as CO2 fell rather than rose, the reverse disruption, glaciation rather than warming, but still a violent change in the same fundamental chemistry. In 2019, a mathematician and geophysicist at MIT named Daniel Rothman published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that tried to formalize this intuition. He modeled the carbon cycle as a mathematical system, what physicists call an excitable system, and looked for the conditions under which it generates the kind of runaway disruptions we see in the rock record. He found a threshold, a critical rate at which carbon enters the ocean, above which the system cannot self-correct and generates cascading instability. When he looked at the Big Five extinctions, 4 of them were associated with carbon influxes that, in his model, exceeded this threshold. I want to be honest that this result is contested. Rothman's paper is influential and widely discussed, but it is a mathematical argument, not a direct physical measurement in rock. Some paleoclimate scientists argue that his model oversimplifies the carbon cycle and that applying its predictions to current conditions is speculative. I think it is worth knowing that this specific framing, the threshold, the excitable system, is an important idea that has not been universally accepted. What is not contested is the broader pattern it captures. Violent disruption of the carbon cycle appears again and again at the boundaries in the rock record where mass extinctions occur. The same carbon molecule, the same chemical relationships, every time. There is a way of looking at this that I find genuinely strange the more I think about it. Carbon is not a villain. It is the element that life is built from. Every cell in your body is organized around carbon chains. The carbon cycle is not a dangerous aberration. It is the system that has kept the Earth habitable for hundreds of millions of years, cycling carbon through living things in rock and ocean and air in a slow, massive, self-regulating loop. Life and the carbon cycle are not separate things. Life is part of the carbon cycle. You are part of the carbon cycle. What the Big Five extinctions reveal is not that carbon is dangerous, but that the carbon cycle has edges. That it works within a range, and outside that range, when the rate of input exceeds what the system can buffer, it doesn't gradually degrade. It tips. And the organisms alive when it tips, regardless of how well adapted they are, regardless of how successfully they have been operating in their ecological roles for millions of years, find themselves in a chemical world they did not evolve to survive. Let me try to make that concrete at a scale you can actually feel. Right now, somewhere in the world's oceans, there is a coral polyp, a small, soft-bodied animal no bigger than a pencil eraser, attempting to build a calcium carbonate skeleton. It is doing what its lineage has done for hundreds of millions of years. It extracts calcium ions and carbonate ions from the surrounding seawater and combines them into a crystalline structure around itself. The process requires the seawater chemistry to sit within a certain range, not a wide range, a specific one. The polyp does not think about ocean chemistry. It does not measure pH. It simply runs its biochemistry, and either the environment cooperates or it does not. If the water around that polyp becomes slightly more acidic, if more CO2 dissolves into the surface ocean and shifts the carbonate equilibrium, the polyp's calcification slows, its skeleton thins, its growth rates drop. If the chemistry shifts further, the skeleton it has already built begins to dissolve faster than the polyp can replace it. And if the chemistry shifts far enough and fast enough, the polyp dies, the reef dies. The entire community of organisms that depended on the reef structure, the fish, the invertebrates, the algae, the ecosystem, loses its foundation. That is one coral polyp, one animal, one tiny chemical transaction. Now scale it up. Imagine not one polyp, but every shell-forming organism in every ocean on Earth, simultaneously over thousands of years, running that same calcification process against water chemistry that is slowly, steadily moving outside the range they evolved for. The brachiopods of the Permian, their shells already thin, already stressed, already failing to calcify properly in water that grows warmer and more acidic with each passing millennium. The ammonites of the Triassic, spiraling into an ocean that no longer holds enough oxygen to support them at depth. The corals of the Ordovician, watching the shallow seas drain away as glaciers lock up the water that was their entire world. The same chemistry. The molecular level and the planetary level, operating in lockstep. This is the cross-scale thread that I find most unsettling about the Big Five. It is not that the same event keeps recurring, it is that the mechanism operates identically at every scale simultaneously. The carbonate chemistry that kills a coral polyp when the pH drops is the exact same chemistry that killed 96% of marine species at the Permian-Triassic boundary. Not analogous chemistry, not a similar process, the same process running from the molecular level up to the planetary level, with the same failure mode at every rung. Your own blood has a pH. It sits, normally, between about 7.35 and 7.45 on the pH scale. If it drops below 7, you lose consciousness. If it drops below 6.8, you die. Your respiratory system exists, in part, to prevent that from happening, to exhale carbon dioxide fast enough to stop your blood from acidifying. You are, in a sense, running your own carbon cycle, exhaling what the ocean exhales, balancing your internal chemistry against the CO2. Your cells produce the same way the planet tries to balance its internal chemistry against the CO2 its volcanoes produce. You are the planet's mechanism written small. The planet's catastrophe written large. Hold up your hand. Every atom in it has been through the great dying. The carbon in your fingertips, the calcium in your bones, the iron in your blood. All of it was on Earth 252 million years ago, cycling through whatever organisms were alive then, and it passed through the Permian-Triassic extinction, the way water passes through a filter. The filter killed almost everything. The atoms came through. Your existence is downstream of that. This is the thing I keep coming back to in Brannen's book, the thing that keeps the cover on my nightstand instead of on the shelf. The question of what it means to be alive on a planet that has tried 5 times to stop being a planet that supports life. Not tried in any intentional sense. A planet is not trying to do anything. But the chemistry that governs habitability has reached the boundary of its stability 5 times in the history of complex life, and each time the result was the same cascade of warming and acidifying and suffocating that we have been tracing through the rock record. And what survived each time was not what we would have predicted from inside the previous world. No one looking at the Permian world, at those extraordinary marine communities, the diversity of form and function that had been building for hundreds of millions of years, would have predicted that a marginal group of reptile-like animals called synapsids, the distant relatives of your ancestors, would be among the things that made it through. They were not dominant. They were not the most successful organisms in the Permian world. They were there, surviving in the corners. And when the Great Dying cleared the ecological board, their lineage, battered, reduced, nearly extinguished, clung to existence long enough to eventually, tens of millions of years later, diversify into the mammal-like forms that would eventually produce the first true mammals. The same logic applies to you and the asteroid. The mammals of the late Cretaceous were small, mostly nocturnal, mostly eating insects and seeds and whatever they could find in the margins of a world dominated by the dinosaurs. There was nothing in the ecology of the Cretaceous that suggested these small, warm-blooded, big-brained animals were the future of large terrestrial life on Earth. The future of large terrestrial life in the Cretaceous was clearly the dinosaurs. They had been the future of large terrestrial life for 165 million years. That is nearly 3 times as long as the entire Cenozoic era, the era of mammals, the era that produced us. 165 million years, and then, in a geological instant, they were gone, and the mammals that had been hiding from them for all that time stepped into the light. You are here because of the asteroid. You are here because of the Great Dying. You are, in a very literal sense, the product of catastrophe. Not despite the Big Five, because of them. There is a beauty in that if you let yourself sit with it. The matter that makes you has passed through the worst things that have ever happened to life on this planet, and it kept going. That's not a metaphor. That is chemistry. That is the literal biography of every atom in your body. But there is something else in the rock record that I have been building toward, and now I want to name it plainly. The extinctions did not distinguish between the successful and the unsuccessful. The ammonites were extraordinarily successful animals. They had survived 3 of the Big Five. They had been on Earth for roughly 300 million years when the asteroid hit. 300 million years of continuous existence, continuous diversification, continuous adaptation to every challenge the planet had offered. They were, by any reasonable measure, among the most successful organisms that had ever lived. And in the 66-million-year-old boundary clay, they disappear from the fossil record entirely, not reduced, gone. The dinosaurs had been the dominant form of large terrestrial life for 165 million years. Success did not protect them. The shell-forming organisms of the Permian, the brachiopods, the corals, the bryozoans, had been building their communities for hundreds of millions of years. Longevity did not protect them. What the rock record shows is that the extinctions were not failures of adaptation to the ordinary challenges of life on Earth. They were failures of the planetary chemical system itself. When the carbon cycle tipped past its buffering capacity, the question was not whether an organism was well adapted to Permian conditions or Triassic conditions. The question was whether an organism could survive in a world where the water was the wrong temperature, the wrong chemistry, the wrong oxygen content. A world that had become, in a geologically brief span of time, fundamentally different from the world its entire lineage had evolved to inhabit. Adaptation is a response to pressure. It requires time. Evolution has no mechanism for responding to a change that moves faster than the generation time of the organisms being changed. When the environment shifts faster than the genetic variation in a population can track, the population does not adapt. It dies. This brings me to the present. Elizabeth Colbert is a journalist who wrote a book called The Sixth Extinction, an Unnatural History, published in 2014. It won the Pulitzer Prize for General Nonfiction in 2015. The book's central argument is that we are currently in the middle of a 6th mass extinction, one caused not by volcanism or orbital mechanics or an asteroid, but by a single species. I want to be careful here about what is proven and what is contested, because the science draws a real distinction, and I think the distinction matters. What is not contested? A 2015 study by Gerardo Ceballos, Paul Ehrlich, and colleagues, published in the journal Science Advances, found that vertebrate species are currently disappearing at rates that are up to roughly 100 times above the background extinction rate, and they arrived at that estimate using deliberately conservative assumptions. They were trying not to overstate the case. The rate of loss, even conservatively measured, is far above anything that can be explained by normal evolutionary turnover. That is established. What is contested? The label. In paleontology, a mass extinction is defined as the loss of more than 75% of all species in a geologically short time. That threshold has not been crossed yet by current data. Several paleontologists argue that calling what we are experiencing a sixth mass extinction is premature, that the term should be reserved for events that have crossed that threshold, and that applying it to current conditions risks confusing the public about what the term means scientifically. Colbert's framing, and most biologists, treats it as a warning. If current trends continue, we are on a trajectory toward an event that would qualify. Strict paleontologists dispute whether we are there yet. A 2025 paper argued the terminology was premature. I do not want to paper over that disagreement. It is real. But I also want to say clearly what is not in dispute. Something is happening to the rate of extinction that has no parallel in the last 10,000 years of human civilization, and its primary driver is the activity of one species. Which brings us back to carbon. Humans are currently adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere at a rate that Brannen describes in his synthesis of the scientific literature as roughly 100 times the annual output of all active volcanoes on Earth combined. 100 times, and it is worth pausing on what the volcanoes did. The Siberian traps, the wound in the crust that produced the Great Dying, erupted over roughly 1 million years. It covered 1.5 million cubic kilometers with lava. It burned through ancient coal and carbonate deposits. It injected carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere on a scale unprecedented in hundreds of millions of years of Earth history. And it killed, in doing so, something close to 96% of marine species and 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species. It nearly ended complex life on Earth. We are adding carbon to the atmosphere 100 times faster than that. I want to be honest about the limits of this comparison. The Siberian traps were not a single year of emissions repeated 1 million times. The total carbon output of the eruption over its full duration was enormous in a way that individual annual comparisons obscure. And the Rothman threshold model, which suggests that the rate of carbon addition is the key variable, is contested. There are scientists who think the comparison between human emissions and the Siberian traps is more complex than the simple ratio suggests. I am not trying to claim a direct equivalence. What I'm saying is this: the mechanism that drove the worst extinction in Earth's history is the same mechanism we are currently operating. The carbon cycle, the same thermostat, the same slow buffering system, the same critical question of rate. Are we adding carbon faster than the system can absorb it? Daniel Rothman's 2019 mathematical model found that 4 of the big 5 extinctions occurred when carbon entered the oceans above a specific threshold rate. He also found that current human carbon emissions may already be approaching or exceeding that threshold. He is careful in the paper about the uncertainties in this extrapolation, and other scientists have disputed the claim. But even setting aside Rothman's specific model, the direction of the comparison is not in dispute. We are moving the carbon cycle in the same direction that the Siberian traps moved it. The question is not whether the mechanism is the same. The question is whether the rate and the total change will be enough to push the system past its buffering capacity. The rock record contains 5 answers to that question, each written in a different layer of stone, each telling the same story. When the rate is high enough, the answer is catastrophic. Put your hand on a rock, not the Nevada road cut, not the dark stripe above the Permian world, just any rock, wherever you are. A stone wall, a countertop, the ground. Feel how still it is. That stillness is an illusion. That rock is the frozen output of a planet in constant chemical motion, carbon moving through air and ocean and stone and living things, balancing and unbalancing, pushing against the edges of what the system can hold. The rock is not still. It is slow. slower than we can feel. Slow the way the 5 dark stripes in the geological record are slow, each one representing not an instant, but thousands of years of chemistry tipping past its threshold, thousands of years of organisms trying to survive in a world that had stopped cooperating. The rock under your hand has outlasted 5 of those moments. The atoms in your hand have too. Somewhere in the geological record of the future, there is a layer that corresponds to right now. It will be thin, it will be distinctive, it will contain a chemical signature unlike anything in the previous 66 million years. The organisms alive during that layer's formation will, in the rock, either continue above it or they won't. The question of which is not written yet. It is being written now in the atmosphere, in the ocean's pH, in the slow and irrevocable arithmetic of carbon. 5 times the planet has crossed a line it could not come back from quickly. 5 times the strange chemistry of this world has turned against the things living in it. And 5 times enough survived to build something new. The stripe is always thin. The silence above it is always longer than anyone imagined.